I'll get going. So, like I said, welcome everybody to the Proteus's webinar, Darryl's top tips for designing occupancy studies. Just a couple of preliminary housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and we'll ultimately make it available at a later date, either in full or in part. But your participant details will not be made public. And then Darryl's happy to take Q&As at the end of the presentation. So the best way to do that is to type your written questions into the Q&A feature in Teams, and I'll moderate that and pepper Darryl with questions at the end. Please just remain muted and keep your camera off during the presentation. And with that, I'll introduce our presenter, Darryl Mackenzie. Darryl's got over 20 years of experience working with species occurrence data, and he's been a key member of the group of colleagues that unleashed occupancy models on the world, starting with their seminal paper in 2022. He's also the first author of the only specialist book on the topic, Occupancy Estimation and Modeling. The first edition came out in 2006, along with a much expanded edition in 2018. And these days, Darryl is the principal biometrician at Proteus, which is a New Zealand-based statistical consulting company, where I also work, and we specialize in ecological and wildlife applications with clients all over the world. So with that, I'll stop sharing and let Darryl take it away.
Thanks very much, Abby. Welcome everybody to the webinar. Let us get ourselves just set up here slightly. So Abby, if you can just keep an eye on admitting people as they continue to join the meeting, that'd be fantastic. There's still a few latecomers coming in. So firstly, thanks very much for joining in and coming along to today's webinar. This webinar, design advice for species occurrence studies. So I've got a long history with occupancy modeling and species occurrence studies now, been playing with them for 20 years. And so I thought it'd be good to give a webinar just to help people out to design these studies better. So firstly, species occurrence measures, they're widely used in ecology. They're used in monitoring programs, studies of species distribution, trying to assess presence and habitat relationships of species, and also for things like metapopulation studies. So they're widely used and very common in ecology and also wildlife studies. And what I'm going to be focusing on today is in particular where we have presence-absence data, so some sort of binary data rather than a relative count or an estimate of abundance. So just looking at the situation where it's fairly simple, where we have sort of presence absence or perhaps used, unused data, but this sort of simple binary type data. Over the years, I've seen a wide range in the quality of the study designs for people that are trying to look at species occurrence. Everything ranging from some fairly well designed and extremely good situations to also those that aren't so good. Those occasions when you feel really bad being the statistician, but actually turning around and say, sorry, you just don't have enough data. So the intent of today is to just try and give people a few little tips so that hopefully we don't have to say you need to go get some more data. It's more that case where we are at that higher end of things. And my basic principle is garbage in, garbage out. It doesn't matter how fancy the analysis is or how pretty the maps are that you've created from some form of analysis. If the underlying data that's being used in those analyses is of poor quality, then those maps may be basically useless. They may not be that accurate in terms of representing what's going on with the species and where it's occurring. So it really is a case of garbage in, garbage out. So hopefully today we can give you a few tips so that we are providing some better quality data into these analyses. So with that in mind, we'll go through my 5 top tips for study designs. Now, I have got plenty more, but I am trying to keep this webinar limited to about 30 minutes. So here we go. So the first one, and it's a fairly basic one, but that's to make sure that you clearly define your population of interest. Now that's going to depend upon the objective. What is it that we're trying to achieve? Are we looking at a monitoring program? And so maybe we're just trying to estimate, what proportion of some area is occupied by the species, or are we interested in establishing habitat relationships with the occurrence of the species? Or is this the beginning of a long-term study where we're actually going to be looking at species occurrence over time? And so we're thinking about how the species distribution is perhaps changing on the landscape over some time frame. So how we define that population of interest will firstly depend upon our objective. But one of the key things to keep in mind, and it took me about 10 years before I had this light bulb moment, is that when we're talking about our population is not the species that we're sort of nominally interested in. The population of interest from a species occurrence perspective is the landscape or that region that we're working in. Because when we're trying to collect our data, yes, we're trying to collect information about the presence or absence of the species, but that's just a characteristic of different points on the landscape, much like our elevation or habitat type or distance from urban areas, things of that nature. It's just some characteristic of the landscape. So when we're thinking about just defining our population of interest, we want to be very clear that it's actually the landscape and the area of the landscape that we're trying to say something about. And one of the key things when we're thinking about and defining our population of interest is that all areas within that population, that statistical population, should be available for surveying. So we want to think hard about that when we're designing our study and defining our population of interest. Because if there are areas that we just won't be able to get access to because it's private land, perhaps, or it's too remote or too far away for us to actually physically get to do our surveying, then strictly speaking, those areas are outside of our population of interest. And part of that may also be that there's areas of non-habitat. So there's areas that there's just no way the species is going to be present there. And so we may exclude them right from the start. Although I've put a question mark after this point because it also depends upon what you're considering as habitat and the dynamics of that habitat, and again, your objective. So for example, if it's a situation where you have regions within this sort of nominal area of interest where currently the species just can't exist because it's non-habitat, if that habitat is dynamic and potentially in the future that may become an area that becomes suitable habitat for the species, then it may be that if this is the start of a long-term program, then even though an area is currently non-habitat, in the future, that region could become habitat. And so part of your population of interest is actually that area of non-habitat at the moment, because in the future and as part of your data collection scheme, you might want to be monitoring those regions that are non-habitat currently so you can identify when they become suitable habitat and when they become potentially occupied by the species. So again, comes back to your objective. If you're thinking long-term, you may have to sort of consider the situation where things might be currently unsuitable for a species, but in the future it becomes suitable. And one of the basic rules of thumb is that any area that has no chance of being surveyed for whatever reason is outside of that population of interest. Okay, so everything within the population of interest, all regions within that population of interest, has to have some chance of being selected for data collection, for some surveying. And one thing that I've often found useful in terms of defining our population of interest is to use some grid-based definition. We don't have to use a grid if we're looking at species occurrence, but one issue is if we're just sampling points, is that we've got an infinite sort of population. There's an infinite number of points essentially, and that can be a bit difficult when we're starting to trying to build predictive models, and also it can sometimes be confusing in terms of how we relate characteristics of the landscape at one point to other points. And so I often find that having something simply defined, some sort of defined sampling unit like a grid cell, really helps when you're trying to think about defining your population of interest and then trying to work through some of the other steps that we need to deal with as well when we're trying to design these studies. Okay, tip number 2, be very clear and try and define the extent of a presence. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that just sit down and think really hard so that when you say a species is present at a location, what exactly do you mean? It's very easily to say it's present, but if you've detected the species in a, say a 5-minute point count, you're doing some bird surveys, if you detected the species in a 5-minute point count, what does it actually mean if you're going to say the species is present at that location? What is the sort of spatial and temporal extent of that presence? Do you really mean that the species is only present within the area of your 5-minute point count, which is fine? Are you interpreting that evidence of a detection as evidence that the species is present at that location during only those 5 minutes you were surveying for it? Or are you willing to infer that your detection of the species in that 5-minute point count is indicative that the species is present in a wider region over a longer time frame? Perhaps you're willing to say, if I find the species in a point count, yes, that was only a 5-minute survey, but I'm pretty comfortable in thinking that that means the species is in the area somewhere over a 2-week period, for example. So try and be very clear about what you mean when you say the species is present at a location. And the reason for that is that by thinking very hard about how you're interpreting the species being present when you do find it, that can really help us when we're starting to work through some of the other issues that are relevant to design in terms of defining a sample unit. So, what's the physical area that you're considering a species is present within? And also, if we have imperfect detection and using some of the occupancy modeling techniques that I've helped develop, we have to define a season, which is this period of closure, or at least where we think there's no systematic changes in the occurrence of the species happening across our region of interest. So by thinking about what's that temporal extent of a presence, that can really help us define what we mean when we talk about a season length from an occupancy perspective. So these are just some of the issues that's really useful to sort of work through. And part of that as well, maybe thinking about the field methods that we're using. Different field methods obviously have different advantages and disadvantages. And so thinking about the actual area that a field method is surveying can also be useful when we're trying to think about how we define this extent of a presence. So for example, we may have some sort of initial nominally defined unit that we think is our sort of extent at which we are talking about the presence of the species. But if we're using, say, point counts and our detection radius is actually relatively large, the effective survey area may actually be much greater than what we're initially considering. And part of that also might be thinking about movement of animals as well. And conversely, we may also have the situation where we're nominally, we've defined some fairly large grid cell, but in actual fact, with our detection methods, we're only effectively surveying a fairly small fraction of that cell. Then it may be that our extent of presence is actually quite a bit smaller than what we're initially thinking. So again, just thinking about the field methods and thinking about how they might be affecting how we define or how it's suitable to define that extent of a presence. And sometimes it's also useful to flip it around the other way. At least I've found it is. So instead of thinking about how you interpret the presence or detection of the species, think about what happens if you don't detect the species in the survey. Do we really genuinely believe that that means the species is absent, especially if we're trying to compare that to how we're considering a presence? Or are we willing to think that perhaps we were just unlucky. We didn't detect it in this 5-minute point count survey, but if we came back tomorrow, then we may detect it. Do we regard that as a non-detection, or do we actually regard that as two absences, because the way we interpret presence and absence is over a very short time frame? But if we're saying that if we detect the species in a 5-minute point count, and that's indicative of the species being in the area or occupying the area over a longer time frame, say 2 weeks, then if we do a point count and don't detect the species in one survey, that's not definitive evidence of an absence, because it could just be that the species is temporarily absent, and if we came back tomorrow and did a survey, we may have some chance of detecting it. So it's just sometimes useful as well when you think about how we're defining, a species being present at a location, and obviously the complement of that is the species being absent from a location, just to think about, exactly how we're interpreting those detections and non-detection events. One other key point is just keeping in mind as well that non-detections are useful. They are data. Sometimes people view them as uncertain data, particularly if they're doing sort of presence-only type methods of analysis. And also in terms of design, sometimes people don't think hard enough, in my opinion, about making sure they record non-detection events, particularly if you're using things like citizen science programs. A zero is data. It doesn't mean no data. It just means that we haven't found it, which is useful, particularly if we're trying to look for perhaps relatively rare species. A zero is just as useful as a one in many regards. It's not always easy to analyze that sort of data, but it is useful information. Okay, tip number 3. If we somehow make some decisions that limit where and how we collect our data, that will have an effect and put some limitations on our inferences. So we'll build in some caveats for what we can say from those analyses. So, for example, if we're doing, say, some surveys, and we've made the decision that we want to just collect data from along roadsides or from trails because that's relatively easy for us. That's where we set up our camera traps, because we can get good photos of animals as they move along the trails, the game trails. What that means is that because we've limited the areas of our data collection to certain types of place, in this case, a trail, that really affects how we can generalize our results. So our population of interest may officially have been set as something quite large, but if we're only collecting data from along roads or trails, then technically we have no statistical justification for saying anything about the regions away from roads or trails, because we've made the decision that we are only going to collect data from this sort of subset of areas. Or it may be that we only want to collect data from a certain habitat type within our region, or perhaps we're only collecting data from ground-based surveys and not thinking about getting up into the vegetation if we're thinking about arboreal species. Any sort of limitation that we place on how we collect our data will put some caveats on our inferences that we can make at the end of the day. That's not necessarily good or bad, it's just the way it works, and so it's just something to be aware of. Another aspect to that is, sometimes it's really hard to get our effort spread, well across large geographic areas. And so oftentimes people will try and, to make life a bit more convenient, they may cluster their effort. So instead of going out to, 100 independently placed point counts across a region, they may decide to put out, to 10 transects, and along each transect they do 10 point counts. So that's some form of clustering of our effort across the landscape. And logistically, that's makes sense, but just keeping in mind that can create some issues, particularly if we have spatial correlation in the occurrence of the species. So the species just doesn't occur independently across the landscape. There will be regions where it tends to be and regions where it tends not to be, which is probably fairly likely in most cases. So in that situation where we have spatial correlation, then clustering our effort is essentially reducing our effective sample size. And so the amount of information we're collecting from our data will be less compared to if we have a more independently placed system of points. It was basically every time we try to make a shortcut that makes it easier for us as humans to collect data from this area of interest, that puts some caveats on our conclusions. There will be consequences to what we can tell from those data sets, either in terms of limiting our inferences, or it's a case that the amount of information we collected is actually less, and so our effective sample sizes will be smaller. And so one thing, if we're trying to avoid this, is we want to make sure we have a good probabilistic sampling scheme. There's lots of options for how we actually do this in practice. I'm not saying that we have to use a random sample all of the time, although it's often very robust in terms of the data that is collected. In terms of it gives us data that we're pretty confident will meet the assumptions of our analyses more in terms of the sampling independence. But there's lots of other options. We can use some form of stratification or systematic sampling. There's balanced sampling schemes. There's unequal probability sampling schemes. There's a whole host of different methods that could be used. But the idea, or the big tip here, is that when we are trying to make sure we collect our data appropriately, if we're using a probabilistic sampling scheme, then we have a much higher chance of doing so. Okay, tip number 4. Presuming we do have an imperfect detection situation, so we don't always detect the species when it's present at a location, depending upon how we're regarding a presence. Oftentimes we are going to need to use some form of repeat survey to collect information about this detection process. And here I'm thinking primarily about sort of discrete surveys, but there's also a more continuous survey situation as well, in which case, again, it's just a slightly different flavor of things, but we are trying to think about making sure we have good effort collected and recorded in a way that we can then estimate that detection process. The issue with imperfect detection, hopefully it's fairly obvious, is that if we have imperfect detection, so we don't detect the species when it's always present at a location, that will lead to false absences. And what that means is that we will underestimate the level of occurrence of a species, which in itself may not be too bad. We may be able to live with that, depending upon how many or what the rate of false absences are. But one thing that people sometimes don't consider enough is, what's the reason for those non-detections? Sometimes, or oftentimes, those detection probabilities may depend upon the same set of factors that are being considered for the species occurrence. And so if you're trying to build models of species distributions or habitat relationships, and that detection process is related to some of the same factors that you are considering for the occurrence process, if we don't have that information about the detection process so we can try and disentangle those two processes through our analyses, then what they can do is lead to some misleading inferences, because the effects of those sort of habitat types, for example, are potentially confounded if we don't have that data on the detection process. So what that means is we may get misleading inferences about what or the size of the effects of different habitat types, for example, on species occurrence. It can even be the situation where things appear to cancel out. If, for example, we have elevation as a positive effect on species occurrence, but it has a negative effect on the detection process. If we don't have that data on detection, so we can only sort of model that raw data, which is a combination of occurrence and detection, it may be that we miss out on identifying elevation in this case as an important predictor of species occurrence. So by having that data, so the effect of imperfect detection is not only that it leads to false absences and leads us to underestimate occurrence, but it also confounds or potentially confounds the effects of different predictive variables on species occurrence. So by having that information about detection, we can sort of disentangle those two processes. And in terms of collecting those repeat surveys information, how we actually do that obviously can depend upon the field methods we're using and how we're interpreting the presence of the species. But that replication could be temporal, which is quite common, where we perhaps come back to the same places, once a week for 3 weeks to collect that repeat survey information. So we've done temporal replication, or we could have spatial replication, where within our sort of what we're defining it as our sample unit, that extent of the presence of the species, once we do find it, we may have 2 or 3 different devices placed out there that we can collect information about the presence of the species. So we have that sort of spatial replication situation, or we can have a combination of both. Okay, so lots of different options for how we do that. That replication could also be, the same method replicated multiple times. It could be different methods being used. It could be different observers being used. So there's lots of ways and flexibility for how we can potentially collect that repeat survey information. And the real key here is to think about it in terms of that spatial and temporal extent of presence. So how are we actually doing that? How do we define that extent of a presence? And then we just want to make sure that we have some form of replication that's conducive with that definition. Okay, tip number 5, this is the last one. And it's one of those eternal questions about how much effort do we need to do? How much effort is going to be enough? And so my tip is to always try and evaluate that. As I sort of said earlier, it's really hard on someone like myself who's trying to advise someone about how to analyze their data when they explain to you all of the wonderful questions that they have. They've gone out to the field for the last 3 years, devoting 3 months of their life each year to collecting data from their species of interest. Maybe it's part of their master's or PhD project. And then they turn around and they tell you they've collected data from 10 sites. I can tell you now that's not going to be enough, because no one sort of stopped them and said, let's just sit back for a minute and let's think about what type of data, how much data are you going to get from that design, and do an evaluation in terms of, is that amount of data going to allow you to answer your questions? So number 1 or number 5 tip, but it's probably one of the most important ones, is to make sure you take some time to evaluate whether you have enough data. Now, what is enough? As I said here, it really depends upon your objective. So what is it you're trying to achieve? As part of your objective, you should have some very clear statements about what it is you're trying to learn from your data collection process and from the following analysis. So depending upon what you do there will depend upon what enough means. If you want to have extremely high confidence that there really has been some change over time, or that some particular predictor variable is important, then you're going to need more data than if you're saying enough is that I just need sort of a lower level of confidence. So it really depends upon, it really is a situation where it's not up to the statistician or whoever's advising you on the statistics to tell you what is enough data, unless or until you've told them what it is you're trying to achieve in the first place. And how exactly we might do that evaluation may also depend upon the objective. So in terms of how you're actually trying to quantify your understanding and your learnings, that will also have some effect on how you actually do that evaluation. And some of the options, there's things like power studies, which personally I'm not a great fan of, but that's a whole other webinar in itself, perhaps. Or we may be looking at, what sort of standard error or what level of uncertainty we're going to get from this analysis of this type of data. How wide might our confidence intervals be if we're looking at more of an estimation type framework for our objective, or perhaps if we're looking at doing some Bayesian analyses, we may want to understand what's the properties of our posterior distributions that may come out of the analysis for whatever data we're trying to collect. In that, simulation can be a very useful tool for trying to do these evaluations. A lot of these different sort of exact metrics that we may use for the evaluation will oftentimes become or can be calculated as part of a simulation study. Simulation allows us to evaluate things that are perhaps a little bit different or more complicated, although sometimes we do have analytic results that we can use as well. And in terms of the species occurrence study, I said earlier, a sample size of 10 won't be enough. I often suggest that, in terms of sample sizes, if you're having sample sizes where you're collecting data from, sort of 30 to 40 to 50 sort of region, I consider that sort of a pilot study. I'd suggest that that's a situation where the amount of data you're getting to look at species occurrence, that's kind of a start. And that certainly if you're getting much less than 20, then you're not going to get very much resolution or precision from your data. I mean, when you think about it, if we're talking about species presence absence, if we have a sample size of 10, then the estimated probabilities of occurrence or proportions of occurrence are only going to be very discrete. It's going to be 0, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, and so on. Okay, so we're not going to have the resolution from the data to be able to identify relatively subtle changes. And that holds, as we have more covariates and more complication, and the sort of back of the envelope type suggestion is that really for looking at presence, absence, and species occurrence type questions, in order to get enough resolution in your data to start identifying some interesting relationships, you really do need to be getting sample sizes that are well in excess of 50, even up to sort of 100 plus. So hopefully that's not bad news or for too many people out there. But that's just simply the fact that there's not a lot of information in zeros and ones. There's not a lot of resolution in there. So you do need relatively large sample sizes. And in terms of repeat surveys, again, I haven't sort of put it here in the slides, but I would consider 2 to 3 is an absolute minimum if we have imperfect detection, and that's only in the situation where detection probabilities are relatively high, in excess of say 0.6 or 0.7. Detection probabilities that are lower, and they can be a lot lower, then we need a lot more replication. And so again, this is something that's really should be getting evaluated before you go into the field to actually get some way of assessing whether you're going to get enough quality data to actually do the things you want to do. And we have worked out, some results to give some more advice on, what would be a good sample size in different situations as well. So there are ways and information out there that's readily available for identifying what sort of sample sizes may be required in different situations. Okay, so in summary, my 5 top tips. So first one, clearly define that population of interest. Make sure you've got a really good understanding about what it is, and like I said earlier, keep in mind that from a species occurrence perspective, your population of interest is not the species that you're interested in, but it's actually the landscape and the presence or absence of the landscape. Sorry, the presence or absence of the species on the landscape is just some characteristic very similar to elevation, habitat type, distance from certain areas, and so on. So really keep in mind that your population of interest is the landscape, not the species. Think clearly and make sure you can define the extent of a presence. So when you say the species is present at a location, make sure you're very clear in your own mind what exactly you mean by that, both from a spatial and a temporal extent. Keep in mind that if we're going to be taking some shortcuts or some shortcuts that are logistically convenient, so we're limiting where and how our data is being collected, that will put some caveats on our inferences, that will put some limitations on the types of things that we are able to say from our analyses of that data set. Presuming we have imperfect detection, make sure we have some way of conducting repeat surveys, or at least some ways of quantifying how much effort has gone into collecting the data that it has and how frequently we are detecting the species during those times, during those surveys. Really, again, it's really important, so that gives us the information to disentangle potential confounding effects of predictive variables on the occurrence and the detection process when we're in that situation. And finally, before you go out to the field, once you've got your designs sort of roughly worked out, take some time to go away and evaluate, can I actually do the things that I want to do? Can I evaluate whether I can put enough effort into the field to answer the questions that I'm trying to answer? So I can't stress that last one often enough. Taking an extra month or two to do that may save you a lot of effort and heartbreak at the end of the study. It really is very useful to actually try and do that before you get too carried away and rushing out into the field and doing stuff. Okay, that's pretty much it in terms of the tips. So if you want to know more, I am actually running a couple of occupancy modeling workshops in the US in just a couple of weeks, actually. So up at the University of Maine. So the Centre for Wildlife Studies is organising and handling the registrations for these courses. So there's one course that's more introductory, and then an advanced occupancy modeling course in the following week. So that's the weeks of the 11th of March and then the 18th of March. So the URL for the course registration is there. It's a little bit ugly, but if you can't read it, just Google Centre for Wildlife Studies occupancy modeling course, and hopefully you'll get some hits come up. The other thing is, like Abby said earlier, we are a consulting company, so we are always here available to provide some help. I'm a sucker for punishment, and so I don't mind giving the odd free bit of advice, but certainly if it's more lengthy or involves more work, it's the sort of thing we need to sort of discuss around contracting. But there are people out there as well, and there's also other sites where you can post questions, and people are fairly generally helpful to give you a little bit of advice and point in the right direction. But someone once told me that free advice is worth every cent you've paid for it. So yeah, just also keep in mind that people are busy. So, but again, if you do want some help, feel free to drop us a line and we can have some first discussions at least anyway. So with that, thanks very much for your attention. I'll stop sharing my screen in a moment, and if anyone's had any questions, hopefully you've put them into that Q&A section in Teams. You've managed to locate that, and yeah, we'll get into some Q&A for a few minutes. Thank you very much. If you want to sign off, that's fine. And as Abby said earlier, we will make this video available so you can share it with other colleagues if you found it useful and want to pass the word around or perhaps review some of the things we've discussed. All right. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Darryl. Yeah, just a reminder to keep typing your questions in the Q&A, and we'll moderate those. There's one in there now from Ian Westbrook, Darryl. He says he often sees studies attempting to increase their sample size by repeating visits to the same sites, and wonders if you can comment on that.
Okay, thanks, Ian. So increasing the sample size by repeating surveys at the same sites. I guess, it depends how that data is being analyzed, but the concern would be whether that's becoming some form of, sort of pseudo replication. So it would depend how that information is being used. If it's repeat surveys back to the same sites to try and estimate detection probabilities, then I'd be comfortable with that within an occupancy modeling framework. Yeah, so it depends upon how that information is being used in terms of, whether I'd be concerned about that or not. If it's a longer term situation where you're coming back to the same sites, once per year to look at change in occurrence, then again, I'll be comfortable with that, provided that we're using an appropriate analysis framework that accounts for the fact that we are coming back to the same sites. Using like a multi-season, perhaps occupancy analysis.
Great, thanks, Darryl. Ian, hopefully that answers your question. If not, give us a shout. There's another question from Rob Shuckard. And he says red listing includes the extent of occupancy occurrence and area of occupancy as criteria. And so how do your 5 tips affect these existing protocols? Sort of how do they fit in that red listing framework?
Yeah, so I guess it's the way that you can, some of these tips would be around the data that you can collect to assess the extent of occurrence or area of occupancy. So the extent of occurrence, that's basically a situation where you look at your landscape, you identify all the points where the species is present on it, and then you draw some sort of line around all of those points where the species is present to define some extent of occurrence. So it's kind of at a larger scale. I was thinking when I've talked about extent of occurrence of presence, that's just at a very localized scale. So we're kind of doing that at lots of points across the landscape. So the sampling tips here would be, where we actually go to try and establish the presence of the species, that then allows us to draw that line around all of the places that we think are occupied. The other situation where we talk about area of occupancy, that's the situation where, for example, we perhaps overlay a grid across the region, and we want to estimate how many grid cells are occupied, essentially. So what proportion of grid cells are occupied? Because it may be that the extent of occurrence might include places where the species isn't currently present, but it's kind of the boundary around all of the places where they are present. So that area of occupancy, I mean, that's, again, the situation where a lot of those tips are completely relevant around how do we pick which places we go collect data from, decisions we're making around what size of that grid cell might be, and how we're surveying it. So I think a lot of those tips are completely relevant to the field designs that we're using to assess those 2 different measures of occurrence.
Awesome. Lisa Thomason has another question sort of related to that point about spatial replication. She's wondering, how do we determine whether 2 detections correspond to 2 distinct individuals or the same individual detected twice, for example?
Yeah, good question. It's one that comes up oftentimes. And one thing, well, at least in my mind, is when we're looking at species presence, absence, or species occurrence, it doesn't really matter. Biologically, it matters, and it matters to the biologist in terms of whether it's one individual seen twice or 2 individuals seen once. But from a species presence absence perspective, the species is present irrespective as to whether it's the number of individuals that are there. So from a sort of presence absence and species occurrence perspective, I don't make an effort to encourage people to distinguish between those 2 situations, because either way the species is present. So yeah, I don't see it as a big issue when we're trying to look at that. Where it can become an issue is if you are talking about species that are perhaps low density but widely dispersed, and the way you've defined a sample unit is perhaps small relative to the home range of the species. And when you're doing repeat surveys, if you detect the species at one location, and you're trying to sample another nearby unit that's actually within that same individual's home range, that depending upon how you're doing that sampling again, if you've got relatively short time frames for your sampling, so that if you detect the species at one point, there's no way you can detect it at the other point because the animal can't get there within that time frame, then that's a situation where potentially there could be a problem with your detection process, and so you may have to think hard about modeling it. But again, it's one of these situations where I think it's just if you sit down and think about some of these issues beforehand, we can design the study or put some protocols in place so that's not too much of an issue.
Awesome. There's some other good questions coming in. I'm going to riff a little bit off of Stephanie Allen's question, which has to do with linear habitats like rivers or streams, as opposed to sort of a continuous gridded habitat. And it looks to me like she's wondering sort of about how, in that case, might you define a site, and would there be maybe ways that you could sort of stratify like a reach within a larger segment, and determine your sampling points based on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think again it comes down to being very clear about what you're defining as your population of interest. And so if you are working in these sort of linear habitats, like rivers and streams, then yeah, it makes perfect sense instead of having a grid, is to basically segmentize up that population. So your population is that linear network, and then you just define segments of an appropriate length across that network, and then it's a case of coming up with a good sampling scheme to select which of those segments you go and collect data from, and which ones you don't. And so that could be some form of stratification, where different sort of types of reaches are sort of combined, and so there's different sampling intensities in different types of places if you want, or some more just simple random sample of segments. And that linear network situation, just to digress slightly, can also be useful if you are in a situation where there's no way you're going to be collecting data off roads or trails. So instead of pretending that your population of interest is this vast network of forests within the Pacific Northwest, that in actual fact you're only going to ever collect data from some of the forestry roads within that region, then be honest about it and define your population of interest in terms of where you're going to collect data from is that linear network of roads, and then segmentize up those roads into some sort of sample unit that you're going to then survey. But certainly, for linear systems, using some sort of segmentation of those linear networks makes perfect sense, as opposed to setting up some sort of grid system.
Awesome. Here's a more practical question. And I'll generalize it a bit also. From Lyndon Liu, there's a lot of packages and programs out now to do these types of analyses. Do you have any general advice for picking one?
I mean, like you say, there's quite a few different ones. So Program Mark is very popular for people that have done any market capture analyses. It's got the ability to fit occupancy models of various flavors. There's Program Presence, which was developed by Jim Hines and myself initially, although these days it's mainly Jim Hines from USGS. It's specifically designed for doing just occupancy type analyses, so it's probably the most comprehensive in terms of widest variety of methods. So those are two sort of Windows-based packages or software that's available. Now there's the R package, RMark, which is basically just an interface to Program Mark, to allow people within the R framework or the R environment to fit Mark models. So you can do analyses in that. There's also the R Presence R package, which is based off the Presence software, but is fully self-contained within R. So it doesn't require the sort of Windows executable to be installed, unlike using the RMark package. So there's the R Presence package if you're using it, if you're an R user. Then there's also the Unmarked package is another one in R, and there's a couple of Bayesian ones. I think it's called SPOC or SP Occupancy, something of that nature, for fitting spatially, fitting occupancy models with some form of spatial correlation in them. So there's a wide variety, and these days I think most people tend towards using R, although there is certainly still people who prefer to use a Windows environment. So there are options there as well.
Awesome. Okay. Got a few more, and I think we have time for maybe one or two more. How about this one? This Simone is wondering, in the case where you're working with camera traps, and say the goal of your study is to monitor some long-run changes in the proportion of area used for a species. Um, and the field of view is minimal with respect to the cell's size. So do you have any tips for allocating the effort or replacing your cameras, either multiple cameras in a cell, or other tips for a situation like that?
Yeah, so good question. It's one of these things where things like camera traps and also point counts, where we are effectively only surveying perhaps a relatively small area, um, and this depending upon the size of the cell we're in. But particularly for camera traps, we are really only surveying a point. But same with things like traps, you know, live traps. You only really looking at presence at a very small area. So that's where it comes down to thinking hard about, if you get a photo of an animal, are you going to interpret that as only indicative that the species is present within that field of view of the camera? Or are you willing to assume that that's indicative that the species is kind of is present within some broader area, outside of the camera's field of view? So that's where it's, up to you to interpret. Um, my suggestion is that sometimes I think people try to make those grid cells too big, and that you're better to lean towards smaller grid cells rather than larger grid cells. But certainly, if you are only physically surveying a relatively small area of what you've defined as a grid cell, then it may be a case that you want to have multiple devices located within that cell. An example of that would be from Australia, where I was helping people with the wild count monitoring program in the eastern New South Wales. And so there they had, I think it was 200 grid cells, and in each grid cell, they had 4 cameras deployed just to try and get good spatial coverage across the cell. So yeah, it's a situation where, depends a little bit on the relative size of a grid cell. If it's very large, then it can be a good idea to have multiple devices out to make sure you've got good coverage of it. Or the other option is you define smaller grid cells, so that you can get the same amount of devices spread out, perhaps across a larger area rather than having to cluster them.
Yeah, thanks. I have a follow-up to that, which sort of is about, would the same advice apply whether you're using sort of a fixed point detector like a camera trap or a hair snare or something, as opposed to something like a scat survey where your detections can be at different points within a grid?
Yeah, and it's a situation where you could perhaps put out, different devices to get different, perhaps, age classes,
Mm.
or if it's part of a multi-species situation or monitoring program, you know, some species might be more likely to use certain or be caught in certain devices than other ones. So again, in the US, people sometimes have these setups where they'll have, devices, different types of devices. So a hair snare, a tracking tube, and maybe a camera, all located within a grid cell, but spaced, you know, 10, 15, 20 meters apart. So you have multiple types of devices available to detect the species. So yeah, that's a not an uncommon design as well.
Awesome. Um, let's see. We have two more. Maybe we can get it through them both.
Try and squeeze them in, and then we'll probably be about
Yeah,
done.
right on time. Let's see. This one. Oops, I lost it. This one is about spatial replication on repeat surveys. And the asker is wondering about habitat covariates influencing differences in detection between surveys, and sort of wondering about including these microhabitat factors as survey-specific covariates, if whether that's problematic or not.
Right. No, I don't think so. Um, so I regard that. So if you've got spatial replication and you've got different microhabitat at each, sort of location you're doing those different repeat surveys, then that's just a survey specific covariate. So I can't see, yeah, in my mind, that would be completely analogous to having temporal replicates and the temperature, the air temperature is different each time you go and do the survey. So we can bring in those covariates on detection process just fine. So yeah, I don't see off the top of my head how there'd be any constraint or why there'd be a difference in trying to bring in the different microhabitats as a covariate when you have spatial replication as opposed to temporal replication at a unit. Yeah, so I think that'd be fine.
Awesome. And let's close it out with Mary Clapp's question, who's wondering if you can sort of point folks towards any resources about building occupancy models that are incorporating non-independence across space, although I suppose we've also been talking a lot about across time today. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So I can think of a few different ones, and so it depends upon the exact nature of the, sort of correlation that's going on, or non-independence that's going on. Um, there are techniques where we can just account for perhaps spatial correlation and occurrence. We can add extra structure to allow that places that are nearby to each other may have a higher chance of, or a more similar chance of being occupied compared to places that are further away. So there was a paper by Devin Johnson in 2013, I think, or maybe 2010, somewhere
That
around
sounds
there.
right.
Yeah, so he had a good paper come out there. We've mentioned it in our book to describe some ways that we can account for that sort of spatial correlation. Um, so that's one option. If it's non-independence, other ways of accounting for non-independence, there's a paper by Jim Hines. So Hines et al. In 2010 was looking at a situation of surveying for tigers in India using spatial replication along transects. And there's a concern that once you detect tigers in one segment along a transect, you then have a higher chance of redetecting them as you move along the transect, because tigers tend to stay on the trail before they hop off. So that's a situation where there's perhaps non-independence in the detection process as opposed to the occurrence process. So that paper was published again, I think it was 2010. So Hines et al., tigers on trails. And then another option where you have a lack of independence of a slightly different flavor would be where we can use multi-scale occupancy models. And so there's a paper by, who's first author of that one? I think it was Jim Nichols, another Jim Nichols, who looked at that sort of multi-scale occupancy modeling where you have sort of a third level of information. So you have repeat sampling units. At each sampling unit, you have repeat surveys, but then within each repeat survey, you have a third level of repeat information. For example, you may have daily surveys, but each day you've got 3 different devices running. So each day you kind of get 3 bits of information rather than just one. So you have these multiple scales at which you can look at sort of dependence. So yeah, there's sort of 3 quick options that spring to mind if we're looking at non-independence, but it's just, again, depends upon the exact form of that non-independence as to how you might best address it.
Fantastic. That answers all our questions and puts us at time. So I'll just say
Perfect.
thanks, Darryl, for your presentation, and thanks everyone online for your good questions. And with that, I think we'll close out.
All right. Thanks, Abby, for moderating, and thanks everyone for attending. And we'll let everyone know when we post things up if they want to view the recording later on. Have a good day.